Welcome, everyone, to our webinar on whether 2026 is the end of test optional. I'm really excited to have you here. By way of introduction, my name is Jim Wismer, and I'm the director here at IV Experience. So, we are a comprehensive college prep company offering services in college counseling, essay and application coaching, SAT, ACT, AP, and other standardized test prep, and academic tutoring. We started as a small company in the Philadelphia area, but have since worked with students in more than 40 states and 20 countries, helping them be accepted to more than 500 different universities. As the director, I have two main functions. I work with our families directly to form plans for standardized testing, and I also train, manage, and oversee our tutoring team. So for our YouTube audience, please like, subscribe, and share our content around. We do these webinars to dispel myths and misconceptions in the college admissions space, and your help in spreading our reach is invaluable. One quick housekeeping item for those in the live webinar. Please use the Q&A feature in Zoom to ask questions throughout the presentation. I will stick around to answer any and all questions at the end here. So without further ado, let's go ahead and jump into today's content. All right. Now we get to start today's content with a history lesson, which is near and dear to my heart. The history of the test optional movement. So I know thrilling stuff, but the context of how the test optional movement came into play is really important in understanding where we are now. So the first college in the US to go test optional after the near universal adoption of the SAT was Bowdoin in 1969. So test optional is not a new thing in and of itself. It used to be largely constrained to small liberal arts colleges. Bates, Colby, and Sarah Lawrence were three of the early adopters. And after that, there was kind of a steady trickle up to the current time of small liberal arts colleges coming through and taking on test optional policies. What we started to see by the 2010s is a few research institutions also taking this tack. And that was a big step because test optional was kind of leaving this small sphere of liberal arts colleges and spreading its reach first to Wake Forest, then to notably the University of Chicago. Now, what happened after the 2010s that changed everything everywhere? Of course, there was a little bit of a pandemic, right? And so during that pandemic, pretty much everyone went test optional for a very obvious reason. Students were not able to take the SAT and the ACT due to social distancing rules, etc. And once students couldn't test, that meant that colleges, of course, still needed to fill their freshman classes. And so they went on admitting students whether they had an SAT or ACT score or not, right? But what we saw happen was that once students were able to get back to school and back to, big rooms of standardized testing full of students, colleges kept those test optional policies. The reasons that colleges kept their test optional policies were due to some key benefits that they got from being test optional. So one of those was more applicants. We saw a massive surge in the number of applications an individual student would fill out and send during the test optional period. Everyone had this sort of lottery ticket mentality, like, oh, well, if Harvard doesn't require scores this year, maybe this is my year for Harvard. Not realizing that their B in freshman math was already going to keep them out, but I digress. The more applications is a benefit to colleges who often are competing to have the lowest admit rate, especially at the top. And of course, the way you get the lowest admit rate is you increase the number of applicants while admitting the same number of students. It also allowed colleges to inflate their test score ranges. So why are inflated test score ranges of benefit to a college? The cynical answer is the US News and World Report rankings. We'll talk about those rankings a few times throughout this presentation, but have been noted examples in the media of leadership positions at colleges whose salaries are directly tied to the US News and World Report ranking of that college. So colleges do often, not always, care a lot about these rankings. And so raising your test score average is a good thing to those colleges. What happens when scores are optional? The students with poor scores don't submit them. And that means that the sort of bottom half of your test scores drop out. It raises your average. It also became easier for colleges to admit what we call in the business institutional priorities. So what's an institutional priority? Essentially, it is a student that a college wants to admit for reasons other than their stellar academic qualifications, we'll say. So there are all kinds of examples of what an institutional priority might be. Some of them are kind of obvious to all of us, right? The quarterback for, or maybe I'll use the example of a point guard on Duke's basketball team does not need to have the same SAT score as your average applicant who's going to be admitted, right? So we can see that institutional priorities take a lot of shapes. Colleges have goals for how many, first generation students to admit in a given year. If someone's father's name is on the library or something like that, that could be an institutional priority of its own kind. Legacy admissions might fall under this for colleges that still value that. And so, without needing to sort of consider test scores, it's easier for colleges to admit those institutional priorities. The other thing we saw here, and not exactly a benefit in and of itself, but colleges saw this as an opportunity to experiment, right? And say, well, what if we did test optional for a few years? Then we could look at our data, see what the effects were, and decide long term, is this something we should go with? Every university admissions professional knew that some colleges were test optional, and this was a chance for them to try it on and see how it fit. And we'll talk about these trial periods a little bit later as well. So we had the birth of test blind admissions come with the pandemic as well. So specifically, the University of California, they commissioned a standardized testing task force from their faculty senate to investigate whether to go test optional in their admissions policy. That task force recommended that the University of California continue to require the SAT and the ACT. So what happened? The University of California Board of Regents made a political decision to go fully test blind because it was their subjective opinion, not supported by data, that standardized tests were an impediment to them being able to admit the diverse class that they wanted to admit. The faculty senate's report showed nothing to that end and actually showed evidence to the contrary. But a political decision was made. The University of California went test blind, and even to this day, they don't use SAT or ACT scores in their decisions. Then we started to see schools come back to requiring tests. And the first to require to come back were southern state schools. So in another America from California, we actually saw a similar situation happen with the University of Tennessee as happened with the University of California, but in the opposite direction. So the University of Tennessee, when they went test optional, like many other schools, they said, hey, we want to launch a multi-year pilot program. We're going to study the data and decide if this policy is for us. What happened? The University of Tennessee's Board of Governors made a political decision to scrap the study and require scores. Sound familiar? But obviously, this one went in the opposite direction. Some other southern state schools quickly followed, notably the University of Georgia and the Florida State University system. So we started to see, kind of as a trend, a lot of southern state schools requiring these scores. Then highly selective schools started to join the fray as well. And I say then, this isn't exactly chronological, it's more thematically linked. But Georgetown went back as soon as humanly possible to requiring scores. I say here, same as it ever was. I hope one day to find a human being that loves me as much as Georgetown loves standardized testing. They are the only school that I know of that requires students to submit every SAT or ACT score they ever have had. Other schools, you get to choose your highest test date or send your super score. Georgetown says, no, we need to see every test you've ever taken. We love tests. So it was not surprising to anyone who knows Georgetown that they were one of the first to go back. MIT came out with a pretty surprising announcement when they came back, surprising to many people. And they just said in their announcement, we can't admit the first generation and underrepresented students who will actually be successful here if we can't see their test scores. And so they went back to requiring test scores because it wasn't fair to the students they were admitting who would take on, $60,000 of MIT freshman tuition debt and then flunk out and have student loans that are undischargeable in bankruptcy for the rest of their lives without an MIT degree. They decided instead, you know what, let's see the test scores because then the students we admit have a much higher probability of successfully completing an MIT degree and having the lifelong earnings that are going to help them pay off those student loans. These days, all of the Ivies but Columbia are now test required, and Stanford and Caltech have gone back to requiring test scores. Stanford and Caltech have even gone back to, well, I shouldn't say gone back to, they are the first to require AP scores to be submitted. Now, when I say that, if your school doesn't offer APs, don't worry. They require AP scores to be submitted if a student has them. If you don't have AP scores, you're not penalized. But if you took an AP course and you have a score on the exam, you must send it if you're applying to Stanford or Caltech. That's a brand new policy and has sure it sort of to me shows how far the pendulum is swinging back. And this is a good time to talk about the emergence of AP scores as an admissions factor more broadly. I have here a quote from October 2023 by John Ladding. He's the Emory Dean of Admissions. We're not as trusting, frankly, of GPA these days. Students are trying their hardest, but grades are definitely inflated and not as connected to true class performance as they used to be. So this is an admission by, a selective college dean that GPA is not telling colleges the same things as it has in the past, and that they're relying more on external measures like the SAT or ACT or like AP scores to evaluate students' preparedness for their institutions. So why is that? Why are colleges not as trusting of GPA these days? Well, the simple answer is two words: grade inflation. What I have here is data. This is from UCLA's Higher Education Research Institute. They started collecting this data in 1966. In 1966, 21.8% of freshmen at four-year American universities had at least an A minus average in high school. That number is now 84%. And I bring this up because this is one of the biggest dissonances that I encounter speaking with families about standardized testing. A family will call me and say, we were just really surprised when we got the results of the PSAT this year. Our student is a straight A student, maybe a B here or there, but, scored something like 1100 on the SAT. All right. And the truth is that if you are an A student with a handful of Bs, then you are in the top 84%, which is to say you're not in the bottom 16th percent. So A's on their own don't really tell colleges much anymore. Whereas a score on the SAT in the 1100s, believe it or not, that's like a 63rd percentile score on the SAT. So that's not a poor score. It's above the national average. But an A average is an average GPA these days. Grading is a cultural practice. Over time, what we as a society have decided deserves an A in high school has changed. And that's just a fact. Now, this grade inflation data is concerning on its face. We don't like to see a trend line go up like this. If everyone has an A, no one does, etc. But standardized test scores over this same period have stayed steady for decades and actually quite recently declined. So what I'm showing here is ACT scores. The reason I use ACT instead of SAT scores is because the SAT redesigned its test and recentered its curve multiple times over this time period, whereas the ACT was totally steady from 1990 to 2023, which is the data period we have here. Over that period, the average ACT score rarely differed from, the 20s to the low 21s, right? That nationwide average stayed very steady. And then after the pandemic, it declined. And that makes sense to anyone who had a high school student during the pandemic or a student of any age, because of course, when everyone had to adapt to virtual school at the drop of a hat, the quality of instruction decreased kind of as a consequence of that. And that means that students didn't learn as much as they could have been learning if they were all able to be in school in that period, right? So standardized testing tells you a similar thing year over year, and it actually tells the truth when things go wrong, right? Whereas grades were often frozen during the pandemic period, where many schools took a policy of, well, your grade can go up, but it can't go down. They were doing this from the standpoint of, well, not everyone has equal access to technology at home. What if they can't really do virtual school? We don't want to penalize people for not having resources. But at the same time, it kind of further exacerbated the issue of grades not telling valuable information to colleges anymore, right? We are reaching a point of what I call the crisis of competence in American higher education. And this is kind of an illustrative example. You may have seen this reported in the news over the last month or so. The University of California, San Diego, just for some context, they are the 29th ranked national university and 6th ranked public university This is according to US News and World Report. I use their rankings and reference them because they are convenient, not because I think they're the best or right or whatever. They're just easy to find. So they have many flaws, but I just use them because it kind of level sets for a lot of people. 12% of the freshmen who take the placement math test at the University of California, San Diego fall short of middle school math standards. And of those students, they're put into a remedial math class. The students in that remedial math class, 25% of them had perfect A's in high school math courses. So let that sink in. A's in math do not mean you can do math. And that is just a fact of American education right now. 42% of those students had taken pre-calculus or calculus. So these are students who are being advanced by the system through math courses that they lack the skills to execute. And they're getting straight A's while it's happening. As a side note, University of California, Berkeley, during this same period, is now offering a math class below calculus for the first time in its history. Berkeley is obviously a school where, they only accept very, very good math students, which is why they haven't offered a course below calculus, but it's just an illustrative example of what's going on here. We're seeing students show up to college less prepared for math than they were in the past. So let's take a temperature check on kind of where test optional is now to catch us up from our kind of history lesson and context of grade inflation. So I mentioned that when colleges went test optional, they saw a massive increase in applications. And so that kind of leads to the corollary. Well, if we go back to requiring test scores, does that mean we're going to be in a situation where we're scared to go back because we don't want to lose applicants? Well, the University of Texas at Austin saw a 48% increase in applicants the year that they went back to requiring test scores. This, I think, alleviated fears for a lot of schools, and I expect it to have an impact going forward. Some schools that are going back to requiring for this admission cycle, we have Johns Hopkins, Ohio State, University of Miami. I have a few guesses of schools that are likely to return to requiring scores soon. Duke, Northwestern, and NYU. And the reason for the guess is fairly simple. When I mentioned that many colleges had said we're going to be test optional for a certain, 2 year, 3 year, whatever year test pilot program, right? Well, Duke, Northwestern, and NYU all extended theirs by 1 year and it will be up. So my supposition is if they only extended it by 1 year, that means that they did that to give themselves an out sooner. So I would look to these three schools. I'm not necessarily saying all three are going to go back to requiring scores. Duke really never went away from scores. They're heavily test preferred in the data that they have released on admissions that way. But these are three schools to keep an eye on in the coming year. One other really important thing for the current climate of requiring test scores, I'm going to keep this as apolitical as I can. It is a fact that the White House offered 9 universities preferential access to federal grants in exchange for them making 3 admissions policy changes, among some other changes in the way that the universities run. The important one for the topic of this presentation is that they must require standardized test scores. So an offer from the Trump White House to universities, incentivize them with federal money to require test scores. If this kind of thing keeps happening, and who can predict what the White House is going to do, or if they're going to stay consistent on something they said in October, and November, or December, or January. But the point is, if the federal government is willing to incentivize schools to go back to requiring test scores, then that's another indication that we're going to see more schools go back to requiring them. If this becomes a sort of universal policy that federal higher education money is attached to certain requirements, among which is the requirement of standardized test scores, we're going to see a massive move back to standardized test scores because colleges are generally cash strapped. Not the wealthiest ones, of course. They might as well be hedge funds that grant diplomas. But your average college in America needs money. So that means that this is something to keep an eye on. The other thing to keep in mind in terms of the current climate is that test optional is a spectrum. So I have here some data that was put together with a colleague of mine, Brooke Hansen from Super Tutor TV, popular test prep YouTube channel. And her blog post kind of tiers out colleges into not just do they require tests, are they test blind, are they test optional, but a little more granular based on the percentage of students they're actually admitting with and without test scores. And based on the analysis that they did, this is how many schools fall into each of these categories of the US News and World Report Top 100. Again, because it's convenient, not because it's right. So the important thing to note about a spectrum like this, especially as you're starting to research colleges and things like that, is that four of these things are just called test optional. So when you look up is so and so test optional, it just says test optional. It doesn't say we're truly test optional. It doesn't say we greatly prefer that you send test scores. It just says, yeah, we're test optional. Test optional on its own just means that they'll accept your application fee and process your application, whether it contains a test score or not. So these four policies, which in practice are quite different, are labeled very much the same way. And that's something to keep in mind. So, a little guide for everyone. If you're going to screenshot one slide in this presentation, it should be this one. Uh, Here's your brief guide to how do I determine how test optional a college is. Step one, you're going to Google the name of the university with the words Common Data Set. The Common Data Set Initiative is a federal initiative where colleges publish certain data, among which are admissions statistics. Step two, you're going to go to section C. You can use the find function, which is to say Control F on a PC or Command F on a Mac, and type in the word composite. That's going to get you to where it reports test scores because it'll say ACT composite score, and that's the only place in the document it will say composite. And then they show you the percentage of students that submit scores, and they show you the average test scores for the school as well. So if you ever want to look under the hood and try to find the most up-to-date data, this is the way to do it. Of course, there are aggregator websites out there that will show you like test policies at this or that school, and there are aggregator websites that will show you average test score ranges and books that are published that will show you average test score ranges. But if you want to be able to find for yourself the information at the source, this is the way to do it. Okay. One other thing I think it's really important to mention in a presentation like this is the future of the ACT science section. So this fall, the ACT changed its format, and one of the changes it made was that the science section of the ACT is optional now. And I've spoken with so many families who are confused by this. Okay, so the SAT and ACT are optional, but then if you take the ACT, it's optional to take the science section also. What do I do? Right now, only three colleges require ACT science: Boston University, Georgetown, and Pomona. Ironically, Georgetown is the only test required school there. BU and Pomona are test optional, but if you submit an ACT score, it must include the science section. Other than that, you don't need the ACT science section necessarily. And one other telling thing, I mentioned that colleges are often incentivized by the US News and World Report ranking algorithm. ACT Science has been confirmed to no longer be part of that US News and World Report algorithm. So the composite score of the ACT no longer includes science. The composite score is what they're using. So all of this is to say, my prediction is that over the next few years, ACT science goes the way of ACT writing, which is to say, colleges don't even look at it. They say a few may say it's optional, but really there's no reason to take it. For the time being, if you're a junior right now who's going through this, if you're a sophomore, it's harder to say. And for you, I would say if science can be an asset for you, you should focus on it and try to improve your score and raise it. We tend to find that ACT science is a very teachable section. It's something that students can often improve at quite significantly. So if you're willing to put the time and effort into test prep to give yourself every possible advantage in this process, then improving in ACT science can still help you at most universities. And I would say that's more likely to be true if you're planning on a STEM major. If you are someone for whom that ACT science section just does not compute, the amount of time and effort it would take would just not be worth it for you. You can take the ACT without it, and almost every college in the country is going to accept your ACT score that way. So this is something to continue to monitor, of course, but we will keep our finger on the pulse of this and update everyone as we can. So I want to kind of wrap up the climate part of this before we get to Q&A with just some brief points of practical advice. So, my first piece of practical advice is that just about every student should take an SAT or ACT diagnostic test. Or rather, I should say an SAT and ACT diagnostic test. I really recommend that students try both tests. Colleges do not care whether you take the SAT or ACT. So, it's in your best interest to try both, compare your scores on both, and see which one you're going to have an easier path to improving on. So we offer one. If you email us, we're happy to send you one you can do for free. We'll grade and analyze it for free and then offer a planning meeting to discuss your results. But whether it's with us or on your own, really doing that at the beginning of this process can save you a lot of time, energy, money, and stress, which is obviously something we all want to do. If your section scores start with sevens, submit the score. So yeah, I've shortened this to if your sections start with sevens, a bit of a tongue twister, submit the score. So what do I mean by that? If you have a math SAT score over 700 and a reading and writing SAT score over 700, maybe you have a 1400, right? And they're both exactly 700. And then you look at the average scores of University of Pennsylvania and you see, wait a minute, their average score is in the 1500s. My score is over 100 points lower than their average. Maybe I shouldn't submit it. Remember that the 1400 is a 90 something percentile score on the SAT, and 84% of college freshmen had at least an A minus average in high school. It reflects positively on you if you can break 700 in both of those SAT sections. So just because it's below the average of the school, remember, colleges are desperate for third-party validation of your grades. There is so precious little evidence on a college application anymore of your brain's ability to do anything on its own, right? So many factors of the application are gameable by AI now. Grades don't tell us what they used to. So standardized testing is it is the single most predictive element of how well a student will do when they actually get to college. That's been shown time and again by data, especially more recently as grades have become more inflated. And so being able to show a college that external validation will help you, even if it's technically below average for a specific school. The other thing I'd suggest is booking a test prep planning call with me. In our resources section of the Zoom meeting here, you'll find a link where you can just book on Calendly 15 minutes into my calendar. I'm happy to kind of talk through what you've done so far for prep, any practice scores you have, and what my advice would be in terms of next steps from here. That's a free service that we offer to anyone who's even thinking about working with us, so you don't have to be kind of a current student. You don't have to pay us a dime for that kind of planning call. We're happy to do that and see where you are and see if it makes sense for us to work together, or if I can just give you some advice that would save you a lot of time and stress in this process. All right. With all that said, blasted through the content today because I thought there might be a juicy Q&A portion of our webinar. So why don't we jump into that? All right. We had a couple. One of the questions is which universities were offered by the White House in October? I hadn't heard about that. I know that the Wall Street Journal and the Washington Examiner both reported on it. I actually don't know what the 9 universities were in particular, so you'd have to look up the story. But if you search that phrase, the Compact for Excellence in American Higher Education, Wall Street Journal or Washington Examiner, you'll be able to find the original articles that I saw it in. Um, all right, then we come to Q&A. All right. First question, are standardized test scores considered more important for students applying into specific majors? Great question. Broadly speaking, I'll answer this with one word, yes, and I'll give an example. So there are some colleges out there that require test scores for some programs, but not others. Often, engineering is going to rely more heavily on test scores than other, fields would. And the answer for why is because of the math requirements in engineering programs. So if you think about MIT's reaction to test optional and their kind of like willingness to move right back to requiring scores, because most of the what MIT offers is STEM fields, you can see that that kind of holds true. For example, University of Pittsburgh, one of our state schools in Pennsylvania, they are one of the few universities out there that actually publish admissions data for each of the schools within the university, the School of Arts and Sciences, the business school, nursing school, engineering school. And their data shows that their engineering school is less test optional than any of the others. So I'd say broadly speaking, STEM fields are going to be less test optional. And then kind of undeclared majors in colleges of arts and sciences or arts and letters or whatever it's called at the specific institution of your choice generally would be more test optional. But these things can all vary school by school. Next question. Any learnings from inaugural Michigan ED acceptances or lack thereof this cycle? Yes, actually, if you go to our Instagram page, we actually did two reaction videos. I think there might actually be three up now about University of Michigan early decision results. So definitely check that out. Next question. I'm wondering if it's worth it to only focus on one test rather than both. I'm thinking of taking both practice tests for the SAT and ACT, but I'm wondering if that might be the best approach. Thank you. Great question, and I'm glad you give me the opportunity to clarify on this because in terms of focusing your time and energy and potentially money you're spending on test prep, you should absolutely only focus on one of these two tests. The purpose of taking both practice tests is to decide which test to focus on. So you try both tests, you compare the scores on both tests, and then you see, do I have a big head start on one or the other? If so, you just take that and run with it. If your scores are closer together, you might want to talk to a test prep professional like myself about, where are the strengths, where are the weaknesses, how do we see your potential for improvement in different areas, and then make the decision based on that. But definitely take both practice tests to get exposure to both tests, to get a baseline score on both tests, and use that to make a decision of which one test you're actually going to put your time and attention into. Another question. If not applying early decision, how many early action and regular decision applications do you recommend? So I'm going to preface this by saying I'm not a college admissions advisor. I am a standardized test prep person. I've worked with some students on college essays at various points in my career, but really I'm not the person you want to be asking this question to. I'll give some very generic advice on it though, which is it really depends on where you're applying and how kind of qualified you are for those schools. In other words, if you have a school that would be considered a likely school for you, right, where your standardized test score is above their average score, where your GPA is excellent, you have a great extracurricular resume, and one of your options is a school that isn't that competitive and you have a very, very, very strong chance of getting into and you know you'd be happy there, then it's not as important to apply to as many schools. Or you can use more of your applications as kind of dart throws if you want to. But having that strong, likely school that you feel confident in gives you a lot more confidence. Whereas if you're less likely at most of your schools, then that means, of course, from a risk management standpoint, you need more applications. So that's my kind of broad, holistic advice on that. But again, I'm not even the person at Ivy Experience you want to talk to about that. If you email us at info@myivyexperience.com, I can put you in touch with someone who can give you a much better answer than that. Next question. If the published average SAT scores are inflated due to the test optional requirements over the last few years, how do you recommend we determine whether to submit a test score or not? Great question. So there's a little math you can do here because the common data set is going to show you the average score and it's going to show you the percentage of students who submit scores. And you can bet that if 50% of students submit test scores, what that college has is the top 50%. And that means that the median that that college is reporting is really the 75th percentile because it's the median of the top half, right? So you have to look at the percentage of students who are submitting scores. You also have to look at what that average is, and you kind of base it on those two things. Broadly speaking, colleges publish their middle 50%, we call it the 25th and 75th percentile scores, and then the median. If you're above the 25th percentile, definitely submit it. And I would even say if you're slightly below the 25th percentile, it's typically worth submitting it because, again, you're going to be in what the true range would be if the missing scores were there. Colleges know that they're missing the low scores because they know what their data looked like before test optional and they know what their data looked like after. So it's not a surprise to them that students with lower scores don't submit them. They know that for a fact based on their own data. So I think you use that 25th percentile score as an anchor if you're on the edge. And then there's also a bit of a subjective element to it as well. It's an art and a science in the sense that if it's a college that is like heavily test preferred, then you might even dip a little bit lower below that 25th percentile and still submit the score because they are really not admitting many students without test scores. So I know that all of that was vague, and I'm sorry. Anyone who works with us on test prep, I'm always happy to work with them on like, should I submit to this or that school? That's a kind of free add-on that we give to anyone who works with us on test prep. And I'm often working with our college admissions coaches as well on students deciding those kinds of things. So if you work with us, I'm happy to like kind of dig through your student's particular situation and give you some more specific advice. But broadly speaking, I hope that was helpful. You mentioned to send scores if you get in the 700s for the SAT. What about the ACT? The equivalent would be about 32 on the ACT. Uh, Next question. If I'm stronger in English by far than math, and I took the SAT practice test and earned an 1170, then what would I recommend? So good question. I would definitely recommend trying an ACT practice test if you're stronger in English than math. The ACT's composite score is made up of English, which is like a writing or grammar section, reading, and math. Two-thirds of that, I can't move the right two fingers. Two-thirds of that is reading and writing. One-third is math. The SAT is made up of a reading and writing section and a math section. It's half and half. So the ACT is two-thirds verbal. The SAT is one half verbal. So if the verbal sections are a strength of yours, by far, it's likely that your ACT composite score ends up higher than your SAT composite score. So for that reason, I'd really recommend trying an ACT practice test. But until I see your results on an SAT and ACT practice test, I can't say for sure because there are a lot of micro differences between the tests. The ACT is faster paced, for instance, and the question types and styles are different. Certain topics appear on one test but not the other. So you really want to look at the sum of all those differences. I wouldn't be able to just say from your SAT score and the balance of those two sections, for sure you should focus on this or that test. I can tell you it's definitely worth the time to try an ACT and see if that might be better for you. All right. It looks like we are through the questions. So thanks everybody for joining us. This will be posted to YouTube and we will be sending that link out to everyone who's here. So if you have any questions for me at any point, feel free to reach out, info@myivexperience.com, or you can call or text our office number here. And then we'll be able to help you kind of point you in the right direction with anything you need. So thanks. Happy New Year. Good luck to all of you who are preparing for these tests, and I hope you learned something today. Take care.